Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
And this is the
Bible Bistro,
a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian
faith. Rock and roll Bible Bistro.
The rock and roll Bible Bistro. That's right. We've determined it's all about the rock and roll here. Why did we say that?
Well, because you said, "Are you ready to rock and roll?"
I
said
did
we should call this the rock and roll Bible Bistro.
And you know what? I'm just looking at our scripture for today.
Yeah.
And it talks about some musical instruments.
There you go.
Maybe
Zithers,
they were
maybe
some harps.
Yeah.
Nothing says rock like harps. It's like a ancient Jethro Tull. Instead of a flute, you got a harp. Anyway, so
I think there may be flutes too.
Well, you know, it is, and horns. It's Chicago. So we're back. We're on the beach.
Ska, ancient ska.
That would have probably been amazing. Ancient ska would have probably been. It would have been something. I mean, they knew how to party.
That may be the meaning of Selah.
When you read the Psalms and it's Selah, just think
ancient
ska. It's like an instrumental break. It's the bridge. Instead of saying Selah, it's just saying ska, and then they dance.
Yeah, something.
The
like
horns
that.
come in.
And wore their,
Well, anyway,
their check shoes.
This has really helped elevate everyone's spirituality as we're talking about ska music. But we are in. Where are we at today?
We're in the historic North Danvers Mennonite Church in. Not downtown, north of downtown Danvers, Illinois.
Yes, if you're watching on YouTube, we are in. It's a low key production day. I mean, it's always low key production for the most part. The last couple weeks haven't been. We were in a studio.
Right.
Other times we do over the web, but we're here just sitting down, chatting today while we're still in each other's presence to capture as much content for you, our listener, as we can. But we're going to continue on in Daniel today.
Yep.
So
Daniel chapter 3.
Daniel chapter 3. So we've had some fun stories up to this point.
Yeah, and thinking about Daniel as a narrative, we've kind of already been introduced to the major players, right? So we've got Daniel, for example. We have his friends, who we've talked about that they have both names that they came with, Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael, and then they're given these Babylonian names. We've talked about them. Where did we leave them? Do you remember where we left them at the end of chapter 2?
Well, we left them after Daniel had interpreted a dream, and Daniel's like given a place in the court,
right? And they're given charge over provinces. So the interesting thing about this, and one of the things that people often notice, and you even asked about it, I think, as we were entering into this, is where's Daniel in this chapter? Daniel disappears in this chapter.
Yep.
And so I'll go ahead and address that now, I guess, because this really is one that, this is the famous story. Whenever you think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, this is the one that you think of. And so this is, the interesting thing is Daniel's not really included in the story at all, even though it's here. So there's a couple of different theories of this. I'm going to give you the ancient Jewish one first, because this is the one I think is probably the closest. This is in the rabbinic writings. They came to this conclusion when they talk, because this has been a question for a long time. This isn't
where's Daniel?
Right. Yeah. Why is Daniel not included in this? And their conclusion, and this is speculation, even in an ancient Jewish context, but their speculation was that he had been sent on a mission by Nebuchadnezzar because he was a high-ranking official in the court. He'd been sent to another country, and so this event takes place while Daniel's out of the country. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are still there in his presence. So that's the oldest explanation we have, really.
Well,
on this.
and the thing I pointed out as we were kind of leading up to this is it was at Daniel's request that the king appointed them places. So it was just Daniel saying like, hey, there's these 3 guys I know, we need to appoint them somewhere. So, in some ways do you kind of go, does the king even know who they are really? It was Daniel's request.
The other theory that some have suggested, and I don't think this is as likely, is that because he was so high-ranking, he was higher ranking than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that Nebuchadnezzar had given him an exemption from having to bow down. But that doesn't seem, the whole point of this seems to be that I want even my high officials to bow down to this statue. And I guess we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So let's go ahead and read the first 3 verses here of what's going on.
Yeah, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and made it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it.
And this is kind of a very typical story where you have a lot of repetition like this, like you mentioned the musical instruments, and we're going to see that list repeated several times. It's the way they told stories in this period. I should have mentioned the other possibility that some people recommend about this story is they say if this was an earlier story, if this actually was a story that was adapted to fit this book, and there's some people who think that's why Daniel's absent. But again, there's too many things that we see connections in other ways. Why do we have the names of these other three characters then? And there's a lot here that suggests to me that this is an original story, and there's some other explanation for Daniel's absence here. So again, the interesting thing, it may seem strange to us because you remember, so I talked a little bit about how we left chapter 2. Daniel had asked that his three friends are promoted into areas, into being basically provincial
administrators over the province.
Over the provinces. And so he had asked about that. But Nebuchadnezzar, we left him exclaiming, the
God
high,
is great.
Yeah, the high
surely
God.
your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings.
And so then, like I said, we shift from I mentioned this at the end of last week, we shift from the very end of chapter 2 into the very beginning of chapter 3, and suddenly he's building this idol. I don't know what else to call it, this statue. Some have suggested that it was the interpretation of the dream that gave him this idea of building the statue, because you might remember
he had the head of gold.
He had the head of gold, and that was the dream, and so he builds this statue. So there's some who've suggested that. There's nothing in the text that says specifically that that's what caused him to think about this, but I do think the next few verses 4 through 6, does give us some idea about what Nebuchadnezzar's doing here. So he called together, and again, as I mentioned before, a lot of his high officials are the ones that he specifically called in order to do this. But then go ahead and read verses 4 through 6 for me, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace."
So what's Nebuchadnezzar trying to do here? I didn't mention this at the beginning. The cubits there, it works out to about 90 feet high. So we're not talking about just a small statue.
Yeah.
We're talking about a major statue. It would have been an expensive thing. He's calling people together and he's asking them to bow down to him. So the question is, what's Nebuchadnezzar trying to do? And I think that's the important thing for us to see. Nebuchadnezzar had defeated all of these different nations. And we talked about this a little in 2 weeks ago when we looked at chapter 1. One of the issues and this has been true throughout history, any leader that conquers in this way has to find some way to bring these disparate people together. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing to conquer, and Alexander the Great at a later period of time is going to find this out as well. Yeah. It's one thing to conquer, but there has to be some way to bring cohesion and a sense of loyalty from these disparate people. Mm-hmm. And so notice how that began, what you just read, verse 4. The herald says, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you're to do." So I think what Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do is he's trying to solidify this empire around his person, right? Mm-hmm. Trying to get them all to pay allegiance to him, and anyone who does not then is going to be killed because they're going to be seen as traitors. They're going to be seen as not loyal, essentially, to Nebuchadnezzar. It's something that I say every leader, but really every nation has to deal with this kind of an idea. We saw it back, even in Pharaoh's day. You might remember in the book of Exodus, it talks about when the Hebrews begin to become numerous, his advisors say this is a problem, because if an enemy attacks us, we can't trust them to stay loyal to us. So they're seeking to exterminate the Hebrew people. You might remember that whole story. That's how Moses is birthed. That's why he's put into the Nile River the way that he is, and this kind of thing. So it's always been an issue, and I would say to this day, you have the issue of how do you make sure as a nation that people are loyal to what you're doing,
especially if you've conquered them.
If you've conquered, and so, but even a division, even a dividing of a nation, I think can cause weakness. But yeah, you're right, especially if you've got these disparate people, and so.
It's the same thing that we in modern warfare, where
Exactly.
we've occupied or another countries try to occupy something.
Right.
It's like there may not be a giant battle, but the people are still against
Sure.
you, and it's causing problems throughout
even
the
the
whole region.
end of World War II, for example, where you have this division of the nations, this decision that's kind of made, and we see the fracturing of Czechoslovakia. We've seen in current day some of those. Because those allegiances were not strong enough, that kind of thing happening, and we could point to other examples as well. But yeah, it's always been a question, and I think that's what Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do. He's really trying to solidify his base here, if you will. He's trying to bring people together and cause them to recognize him. So I think that's why we have such a harsh punishment. Traitors act even in the United States is punishable by death. And so I think Nebuchadnezzar, this idea of being thrown into a furnace, now it seems like a pretty nasty way to have a death penalty, but that's what he's trying to get across, this idea to cause these people to get a sense of loyalty to him. Thoughts on that, or anything else?
I don't want to go into a furnace. Yeah, that's my thought. I mean, it's the same thing we talked about. It's just that it's trying this cohesion. We read about in Daniel 1 why they were being taught literature and so forth
Right.
of Babylonians and so forth. And so we kind of see this the narrative continues. How do we
Right.
bring these people together under one roof?
And we're going to see some similarities here to chapter 1. So let me read verse 7. And so here's the conclusion. After the herald had said this, therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And this is what brings these Judean young people into conflict. Is they're brought into a place where all these other nations, and if you came from an idol worshiping nation, this doesn't cause you a problem. But the similar thing we saw in chapter 1, where they say, well, eat these things that their God had told them not to eat. One of the very first things, as I mentioned in the Ten Commandments, you shall have no other God before me. You shall not make to me any graven image, and you will not bow down your knee, right, to any graven image. And so this is central to their belief system. They're not going to give allegiance to an idol.
This is so interesting to me because leading up to Babylonian captivity, they've been not obedient. The Israelite or the Judeans had not been That's the whole reason. This is what caused the problem. And then all of a sudden, once they're in the context of like occupation, it's like, oh yeah, now I remember. Yeah, no, I couldn't do that.
That's a very important part of this story, and I think that's what's going on, because you got to remember one of the things that creeps into the prophets. I should say creeps in. One of the things that becomes an important part of the prophets' language during this period of time is the idea of a remnant. Okay, and usually we call it a righteous remnant, right? So yeah, Babylonian captivity happens because they fall down to idols. They worship they worship the gods just like God said that they would.
They worship the gods of the people around them,
of the Canaanites. And so what happens here now, though, is we're talking about the faithful ones. These are the ones, the righteous remnant. Not every Israelite's going to go back into Israel, right? That's the whole thing of Ezra. Not everybody goes back. In fact, there's a lot of people who say, I'm pretty satisfied here. I'm married. I'm doing okay. It's only those who are driven, in a sense, by a sense of wanting to reestablish this promised land that are the ones who go back. And that's an important part of this whole story. And let me just look ahead a little bit. It also, when we talk about worldview, that sense, Ezra is the we call him sometimes the godfather of Judaism, or I call him the godfather of Judaism, because he's the one who really says, hey, we're going to keep the law now, because we saw what happened when we did it before. And he says that to an extent. Here's what it becomes, is not only are we going to do what God has told us to do, but we're going to set fences and parameters around it. We're going to define it all very carefully. So God says, keep the Sabbath day and make it holy. And Ezra is going to say, well, what does that mean? How far can I walk on the Sabbath day and I'm not working? What can I do on the Sabbath day and it's not working?
Is this a prelude to the Pharisees?
That's exactly where I was going with this, because that's what it becomes. And in the sense of a worldview, then Jesus comes along and says, oh, you've done really well at keeping the law, but you've lost sight of what the law was supposed to do, which really the law was supposed to change people's hearts so that they were like God. The law is an aspect of, I always say it's a revelation of the nature and character of God. It shows us what breaks his heart and what is desirable for him, what kind of people he wants to create, wants us to be, and so Jesus is saying, you've gotten to this point now. He always talks about minutia, right? You tithe your household herbs, right? You tithe your mint and your dill. But then he says in another place, you don't take care of your parents. You call things that you're going to give to the temple later on Corban, that this is dedicated so that you can't use it to take care of your parents, but you can enjoy it during your life, right?
Right.
And only at the end of your life is it going to go to the temple. So they had gotten it's legalism, right? They'd gotten very good at knowing the loopholes of the law and knowing how to keep the law without understanding what the law was teaching. Paul calls the law a guide, and so that's what we're seeing, I think, in the beginnings of this.
So this is the faithful remnant.
This is the faithful ones. So they're the ones who say, "I'm not going to eat that stuff," and they say, "Here, we can't bow our knee to another god." And really, so here's how when I preach this or teach this, I talk about the question of allegiance. To whom do we owe allegiance? And that's for Christians. I don't care. We have listeners not only in the United States and we have listeners in other places. I don't care what country you live in or what nation you live in. At some point, that question of allegiance has to be answered. To whom do we owe our allegiance? Now, there's a certain amount of allegiance you would think that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have to Nebuchadnezzar because of things that he has done for them. But there is a higher allegiance for them that they say where it comes. Let me quote the apostles in Acts chapter 5. We must obey God rather than men. If there comes a point where the leaders, in that case it's their religious leaders, but there comes a point where, in this case, your political leaders are calling you to do something that is against the very law of God, then you have to say, I'm going to obey God rather than people. And they had a very clear sense, we are not to bow our knee to an idol. And even as you point out, they had in their recent history, right, that had affected them personally, they'd seen what the effects of bowing down to these idols, as you mentioned, in the promised land had caused. So that's how I would respond to that. So every language is mentioned here, and I've been reflecting on this, and I'm kind of wondering, does this show a human attempt to reverse the scattering that took place in Genesis chapter 11? Because it's a similar kind of thing, right? We have this building on the plains of Shinar, which is Babylonia, the same place. We have this building of this pyramid or ziggurat or whatever you want to call it, tower is what the scriptures call it, to reach the heavens. And we had a little conversation about that yesterday. I guess one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is what is the purpose of God scattering the people in that? Why does he? What causes God to confuse the languages and scatter them at that point? And what would you say in chapter 11, Genesis chapter 11? This is the Tower of Babel. And God says if they do this, then nothing will be impossible for them. And so he goes and scatters.
I think it was
languages.
a sense of, you're probably going to correct me on this, but a sense of not relying on God.
I think
they were relying on themselves. If we all work together, we can just rely on ourselves and we can accomplish what we need to accomplish. even though they were trying to build a tower to the heavens.
I would very much agree with that. And here's what I would say is this an abortive attempt? Is this kind of a human attempt, maybe a better way to say that?
Because we're in the same place where this tower
of Nebuchadnezzar
would have been.
Trying to, on his terms and around him, reunite the peoples, right? Cause there to be one empire. Is this a part of the tension that we see in Scripture of an attempt to reach this idea of a unity, not on the basis of God's creation, right, but of how He has made us, but instead around this other individual
empire?
And that's I think a constant question. Kingdom of God. Right, and that's the kingdom we've already seen. We've already talked about in the last chapter that there's going to come a kingdom that's going to smash the idols, right? That's going to smash the statue, and I think this is a part of that contrast. When we lay these side by side, here's an attempt to surround this idol, draw people together by that idol.
Yeah, I wonder, does Nebuchadnezzar have an idea of, like, when Daniel's interpreted his dream, is that fate, or is that something that now that it's a dream, is it a set in stone reality? Is he trying to go, you know what, it's I'm going to force it, and I'm going to try to make my kingdom last for, It is. I don't know. I'm just speculating. Like, what goes into a person's mind after they've had that dream, and here they are now.
I think that's interesting, and I do think it is an attempt on the basis of a different kind of power to create this empire. Yeah, I do think
instead of him being flattered by that he's the head of gold, he's dismayed by, what do you mean? There's going to be someone
right
that's going to crush my kingdom.
Right. So what happens then, if you look at verse 8, it's kind of interesting. Some of these astrologers, or we mentioned last week, Chaldeans, however we understand that, they came forward and denounced the Jews. I just wanted to mention this. It's very interesting. They use an Akkadian phrase here that has to do with basically 8 pieces of them.
What?
That it's like we would say chewed into somebody or something along those lines, right? Trying to destroy them on their own. But go ahead and read verses 8 through 12. I just find that phrase interesting.
Yeah. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Okay,
so this becomes then, as I mentioned, a question of allegiance. To whom does Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego owe their highest allegiance? And interesting, too, that here are the very thing that I think Nebuchadnezzar is trying to do, unite this people, is we see this kind of jealousy from different groups within that. So these Chaldeans, and again, if they're astrologers, maybe they're like, hey, they've had more success than we've had. They've showed more wisdom than we have, and so they
should be thankful they'd be dead by it. The astrologers would be dead without Daniel and the boys.
Right, but they're jealous. So here's what happens then. Here's the response is that Nebuchadnezzar gets mad and he brings them before him and asks, "Is this true?" And here's what they say. Here's the way that they answer him. I should read this. I'm just going to read this last part of this. If you do not worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing fire. And then Nebuchadnezzar asks this question, "Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" And there's that thing that we've been talking about. There is a God in heaven, right? Back in chapter 2, what gods can reveal these things to us? And Daniel says there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. And here is Nebuchadnezzar's question: what God could rescue you from me? If I decide that you're going to be cast into a blazing fire, who's going to save you is the question. And so here's their answer. Here's the way that they respond to him. And again, it's that question of, at what point do God's people Where does that issue of allegiance leave us? So verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, and this is an important part of this whole story, even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. So that's an explanation. Or example, I guess would be a better way to say it, of the kind of faith that God calls from his people. Mm-hmm. It's the kind of faith, we know that God is able to deliver us. We don't know that he will.
Right.
But even if he does not,
mm-hmm.
we're going to serve him rather than these false gods. And that's I think you and I talk about this a lot. I know it's one of the things that bothers you with some modern worship music and some preaching
mm-hmm.
today is always that, the Christian life is a victorious one.
Right.
When there clearly are examples of martyrs.
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Stephen, Paul himself goes through various hardships and various trials. Most of the apostles, and there is this line of thinking out there, and it's one of these things. I always say the most difficult lies is a half truth, right? And I think the words I just read are such a good explanation of this. God is able to deliver us, mm-hmm. right? We're not denying that at all. God is able to do that. And I think we have to hold that in our hands and acknowledge that. God certainly can deliver us from whatever situation we find ourselves in. But even if he doesn't, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah.
Whether he chooses to or not, we are going to put ourselves in. That's what trust is. We're going to place ourselves in his hands. Mm-hmm. That's what it means to have faith.
Yeah, you're right. That is the thing for me. It's it's like someone that has been sick and it's in a very tenuous situation, and they're healed and said, "Well, God showed His faithfulness to us." And I'm always like, yes, and if they had not been healed, God is still faithful. Like the faithfulness is not shown in my conquering of my problem.
Right.
God is faithfulness.
I think we have to be careful to hold both those together, though.
Yes, I agree.
And that's what, sometimes when we have this conversation, I'm like, yeah, but we have to acknowledge that, yes, he can, right? We're not denying nothing about his power. It's everything about what he chooses to do. And true faithfulness, I think, is placing ourselves and trusting ourselves that no matter what happens, we're trusting God in this. Now, this story, and we always like the stories that turn out well.
Yeah,
right?
That's why they're in here, because they turned out well. What you don't know is they had a couple cousins that tried the same thing and burned up. Just kidding.
So yeah, those other guys. We'll go ahead and read verses 19 through 22.
Yeah. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other trousers? All right.
Whatever.
Turbans and other clothes were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace.
So we're imagining here a furnace, and we're going to see in a minute there seems to be a door at the bottom of it, but we're imagining a furnace that they're being thrown into the top of, and the detail of the soldiers themselves dying just from getting close to the heat is showing, basically this is a image of the furor that Nebuchadnezzar is demonstrating or is showing to them. So that's what I think. That's what I think is going on here. So I do mention this in 1 Peter chapter 1. I always find this interesting. This kind of is an echo, I think, of this kind of language. Peter says there to Christians, writing. I said chapter 1, 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. He says, no, it is chapter 1. I was going to say I got chapter 2 in my notes, but it is chapter 1, verses 12 through 13. No, it's not. What am I doing?
Is it
First
Second Peter?
Hold on. I have no idea what I'm talking about. It may be Second Peter chapter. Let me look.
It's all right. Here's a short break brought to you. If you're enjoying the podcast, we invite you to support us. You can go to thebiblebistro.com, click on the upper right-hand corner, and support us on the Patreon.
Right.
Or you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram at The Bible Bistro. You can, and if you support us, you can get some swag like a coffee cup, T-shirt, or...
Okay, I can't find it.
He can't find it. So right, back to
what it talks about a fiery ordeal. I'll have to go look that up. It talks about the fiery ordeal, even though these fiery ordeals have come. Basically, talking about again our ability to withstand the difficulty, the trials that have come. Anyway, that's all I was going to.
1 Peter 4:12.
4:12. Okay. Goodness. You want to read it? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not even going to try.
I did it faster than you. Here. Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed.
And so Peter, in the same way, is writing to people who are dealing with these difficulties, the same kind of question, because he talks about this idea of authorities, right? And they're not going to punish you for doing something wrong, right? But if you do something wrong and suffer, but if you suffer, even though you're doing something right. And so I think it's this kind of a story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that Peter has in mind there. And I even wonder if that idea of the fire ordeal is meant to make us think of that's this story. Mm-hmm. At least it's a parallel. It seems to be a parallel kind of story. So, this is the thing. And again, as I mentioned, we all have to come to terms with we have an allegiance to the nations in which we live. And Paul, Peter, all of them say, hey, we Jesus, pay your taxes to Caesar, right? Mm-hmm. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But there also comes this point where we have a greater allegiance to God, and we have to wrestle with where does our allegiance to the nation end, and where is it overtaken by our allegiance to God, if it does. And the thing I want to make clear, and this is what we were just talking about, is even if we stand up for what is right, sometimes, and this is the case with Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, you're still going to suffer the consequences for that. Do you see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah.
And I think sometimes when people talk about, well, I'm going to stand up for this, right? It's kind of like what I talked about in the first when we talk about the first chapter in the second episode of this series. I talked about then this idea that. I'm trying to think exactly how I put it, but it's a quiet kind of influence, right? Mm-hmm. We sometimes think we need these platforms and this kind of thing, and I think it's the same here. We think, hey, if I stand up for God and I do what's right, it's going to turn things to my favor. Mm-hmm. Well, no. Sometimes it means you're thrown into a fiery furnace, mm-hmm. and we trust ourselves to God. We know that He is able to deliver us, but we also know even if He doesn't, we're doing what is right. That's a quiet kind of faithful faith, mm-hmm. That we're called to. So I didn't express that very clearly, but you get what I'm
think
saying
it's kind of just because you're taking a stand doesn't mean the situation's gonna change,
turn out right.
Right. Like, that's not just, I think that's, that can turn sour for someone. It's easy sometimes to open our mouth and be like, and then it's like, right. And then it comes back and it's like, well, where are you, God? Why? Right. It's like he's still there, but it doesn't necessarily mean the situation's changed. And we think, well, we want to change the culture. We want to change the way things are in the culture. But even if we're not able to do that, we do what God has called us to, I guess, is what mm-hmm. One of the other part of this I'm trying to say. Yeah. Okay, so go ahead and read, because I've closed my Bible. I'm not going to try anymore today. Go ahead and read what happens here, verses 23 through 25. And this, of course, is the high point of the story in a lot of ways. Yeah. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They said, "Certainly, Your Majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them.
Go ahead.
Okay. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's got a thing.
Yeah.
I'm either going to burn, bow down, or I'm going to burn you, or, I'm going to cut you into pieces now.
Well, a couple things. So it goes back to, remember he said, what kind of God is going to save you, or what God can save you from my hand? And here's the answer.
For no other God can save in this way. So let me ask you a question about this. In our Bible, so when Nebuchadnezzar is talking about, we have the capital G God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then we have lowercase g God.
In Hebrew, the word is Elohim that's translated there. And I guess you have to know some Hebrew to know this, but the word, the im in Elohim is plural. So God, the word God is always plural. Let's say it that way. That's a simple way to say it in Hebrew. Even when we translate it singular with a capital G, that the word is plural. The God, gods. And so this could read son of the gods or son of God. It could read either way. And we have to look at the context. We do this with other words. There are other words that are kind of like this. It's a little hard. It's a language thing. It's a little hard if you haven't spent some time thinking about this. Mayim is the other example that I think of, which is the waters. It's always plural, right? And it's just a way that what language works. Okay.
So I just thought it was interesting that Nebuchadnezzar instantly kind of goes to, up to this point, we've had lowercase G God, and now we have, as he's talking capital about G. The God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, it's the capital G. So
it's always plural, and that's just, again, like I said, the nature of the language. But it is interesting, and here's, I think, this is kind of the culmination of this story, is you've got this fourth person. He calls him an angel, messenger of God. He calls him looks like a son of the gods. However we understand this, some people understand this as the pre-incarnate Christ making an appearance. Sometimes people, anytime you have an occasion like this, some people want to see this as the angel of the Lord, which they see as the pre-incarnate Christ. However we understand this, whatever kind of messenger it is, what we have here is God's presence with his people in the midst of their ordeal. Okay, let me go back and say that again. This is the presence of God with his people in the midst of their trial. And that's what I think this represents. However we understand it, whatever you do with this, and this idea of God with his people is an important one. Of course, that's what Emmanuel means. God with us. This is the promise that God makes over and over again. I will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Right? In the book of Revelation, this is the idea that we see the consummation of that. God is with us. Jesus makes this promise to his disciples. Just one example, Matthew 28, happened to be preaching on this weekend. Lo, I will be with you. So use a little King James there, but look, I'm with you even to the very end of the age. No matter what you come to, I am with you. And that's, the remain in me and I will remain in you. That's the promise, is God's presence with his people is the promise that we have even in our trials. It doesn't mean that we're always saved from our trials, but what we are promised is God will always be with us, even in difficulty like this.
Yeah. What I think is interesting in this I mean, obviously that's a great point. One thing as I'm reading this here is the people that came to see, that came out of the fire. We have satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. What we don't see are the astrologers that accused them to begin with. The Chaldeans that, it says the astrologers earlier, and it's like, why aren't they there? Well, they're the ones that started the whole stink to begin with.
It's interesting, and also we see the degree of the miracle here, the completeness of the miracle in the description of they don't even smell like smoke. Their clothes don't even smell like smoke.
What's interesting, the ropes are gone that were used to tie them up, but none of the hair was singed, the robes were not scorched, and there's no smell of fire. It's a total,
complete miracle here of the saving of them. God with them and saves them, protects them in whatever way. I mean, what an amazing thing. And then the vindication. You went ahead and read that the final vindication. We've seen that with every chapter, right? Mm-hmm. Chapter 1, the vindication is, you guys are 10 times wiser than any of the rest of these. Everybody should eat this way. And then in chapter 2, it's you're the one who's able to interpret my dream, and I'm going to make you into this. You go from being killed into becoming one of my advisors. And here, the same kind of thing. Instead of your disloyalty, now I'm not going to allow anyone to say anything against your God. So that's kind of the repeated stories that we're going to see is, again, we had it set up in the very beginning where it's going to be this contrast between the gods that are worshipped by the Babylonians and the true God, the God of the heavens.
Yeah, I was thinking about this as knew we were going to talk about this, is like we have King Nebuchadnezzar who has Daniel has, up to this point, it's been about the food thing and they look better. Right. Then we have interpreting a dream and like, your God is the right God. And now we have the physical. Like, is this like a revealing to Nebuchadnezzar of like the God of Daniel is not just a revealer of dreams, because that was more of a spiritual reality being unveiled to him. And now it's like, because Nebuchadnezzar seems to have like, well, what God could save you.
Right.
Even though Daniel has interpreted a dream and, is in his mind, I'm thinking is he separated like, well, there's spiritual things that a God, that God can reveal spiritual things, but surely he can't do the physical part of this.
Even as you're saying that, I hadn't thought of this, but in chapter 2, this is just occurring to me right now. The whole idea of God with us. Remember, that was one of their statements: is the gods are in the heavens and they don't come down to the earth. Mm-hmm. Well, here's God's messenger in the midst of the fire with them, and so it's
a further kind
physical
of
manifestation,
full unveiling of who this God is.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but and again, whether we understand this as a pre-incarnate Christ or not, that's a theological question we could probably wrestle with. But what is certain here is this is a illustration of God's presence with His people, and like you said, a physical presence. It's whether it's an angel or the angel, however we understand this. God has sent someone to protect His people in the midst of this. There's some other cool stories like this even earlier. One of my favorites is Elisha, where he asked the eyes of the young servant to be open, and he sees the chariots of fire that are surrounding them, protecting them. What can't be seen, the ministering spirits of God, what can't be seen by normal situations, but God, that doesn't mean God's presence isn't there with us. And so just a constant reminder. I like, we cut down a lot of contemporary music, but I like the angel armies because of that. It refers back to that idea of kind of being constantly surrounded by God's ministering spirits, and even in ways that we can't always see the effects, right? We trust and we know that He is there.
Yeah, good.
Anyway,
well, this is great.
Yeah, good.
We're working our way through the narrative part of Daniel here. This is good.
Chapter 4 is a weird one, though. Next week will be interesting, but yeah, go ahead.
No, it'll be good. It'll be weird's good. You gotta work through these things. I appreciate just going through some of these narratives, and I think the thing is when you feel like these stories or you've read them so many times, to go back through them and kind of go, to look at it a little bit, take your time through it, to kind of reveal let it reveal itself to you is good.
Yeah.
So,
and to see these themes, I think, that are very clear in the book, and what the book's really trying to teach us, and what we can learn from it.
Well, and I think even from the beginning in that first episode, if you haven't listened, with the names, the Daniel 1, the names, those inversions of the names from that happens there, you kind of go, oh, I know where this is going. This inversion of God and the God of the Israelites and God of the Chaldeans. So, all right. Well, Brian, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Look forward to next week as we dive into the weirdness of Daniel 4.
All right. See you then.
See you. Bye.